Anatomy and physiology students, we are on to lab number 20. And I am hopeful that this might be the shortest lab video of the semester. What we are doing today is looking at reflexes. So a reflex is often called a reflex arc. And we'll talk about why in a second. A reflex is a rapid, automatic, predictable response to a stimulus. So rapid, automatic, predictable. So rapid meaning it happens quickly. Automatic means you don't have to think about it. You don't have to consciously do anything. Predictable means I know if I give you a stimulus, I know how you should normally respond. So there are 5 basic components, and we do see all 5 in this picture. So the stimulus in this case is the stabbing of the skin with a little nail here. And that's number 1, okay? That's not number 1. That's the beginning of the reflex, all right? Now what has to happen is there has to be a receptor that detects maybe the pressure, the pain, what have you. So the receptor is the first component of the reflex arc. And then the information from the receptor has to travel to the central nervous system. And what we see here is this blue sensory neuron coming back to the spinal cord. We see a nice spinal cord cross section. So the second component is a sensory neuron. Now notice how the sensory neuron is a unipolar neuron. We don't see it, but its cell body would be in a dorsal root ganglion. Then its axon is ending in the dorsal horn of the cord here. Now in this particular reflex arc, we have the sensory neuron synapsing with an interneuron. And the interneuron is acting as the integration center. The interneuron is processing the information from that sensory neuron and quote unquote making a decision to tell the next player in our sequence. Now, you don't always have to have an interneuron. Sometimes you can just have the synapse between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron. Speaking of the motor neuron, that's number 4. So the 4th component of our reflex arc is the motor neuron coming from the ventral horn of the cord out to the effector, which in this case is skeletal muscle, which would allow you to retract the area that was stimulated with the pin or nail or whatever it might be. Now the effector doesn't have to be a skeletal muscle. It could be a gland. It could be smooth muscle. So it could be something else. Cardiac muscle too. All right, those are the 5 basic components to a reflex arc. It's the shape. This is the general typical shape. And that's where we get the word arc. So we've defined reflex. We've got the components, the structural components of a reflex arc. Now, why would you want a reflex? I mean, you want an automatic response to a painful stimulus to get you out of danger, right? There are a lot of reflexes involved with muscle tone and balance and movement. So you need reflexes in that respect so you don't fall over, so you don't make mistakes in your movements. We'll see some examples of different reflexes today. All right, let's move on to the next slide. This is a classic reflex. It is called the stretch reflex. You might have experienced this, you probably have, right? At a doctor's office. You sit on the table, your knee is bent, the doctor strikes your patellar ligament with their reflex hammer. And what that does is that striking of the ligament is going to cause a little stretch in the quadriceps muscle anterior to the femur here. Now, there is a receptor you have receptors in your muscles called spindles that measure stretch. So you know if a muscle is being stretched too much in one way, that might make you lose your balance, lose your posture, whatever. So we're always measuring that. And so the receptor, the muscle spindle, is going to then tell this sensory neuron that there's more stretch. The sensory neuron is going to send a signal onward. And again, we see it's a unipolar neuron here, dorsal root ganglion for the sensory cell body. And the axon goes on into the dorsal root and continues onward to the ventral, sorry, I said into the dorsal root, I meant dorsal horn, into the dorsal horn, and continues onward into the ventral horn, where that sensory neuron synapses with a motor neuron. So notice we have no interneuron in this case. In this case, the integration center is just this synapse right here. And then we got our motor neuron taking a command to the muscle fibers themselves, telling them to contract, which is why you see that little kick out with your foot when you have this reflex tested on you or you test it on somebody else. Feel free to give this a try at home. You know, you don't have to use a reflex hammer. You don't really want to use a regular hammer either. You want to find something that's not going to like cause dramatic pain, but is going to be enough to elicit a response. So if you do this, let me know what you did, what worked and what you did. Now, when we're talking about this particular stretch reflex, there are a lot of adjectives we can use to describe it. This is called a monosynaptic reflex. And that word monosynaptic refers to how many synapses we have in the integration area, integration center. In this case, there is just one synapse here. So monosynaptic. Now this reflex can also be described as ipsilateral. We know lateral means side, ipsi means same. So what this means is that if you strike the right patellar ligament, the right quadriceps muscle is going to contract. So the response is on the same side as the stimulus. So this is an ipsilateral reflex. It's also a spinal reflex because the integration center is in the spinal cord as opposed to the brain. Lastly, it's a somatic reflex because our effector is skeletal muscle. If it were an autonomic reflex, it would be either gland, smooth muscle, or cardiac muscle that was playing the role of the effector. Okay, so this is a great reflex that we can see here. Let's look at some more examples. So I got another reflex here. This is called the withdrawal reflex. Another one that's easy to test. You've probably unwittingly tested this at some point in your life where you touched something hot and you withdrew, you pulled back your hand or your foot or whatever body part was touching it. Now in this case, there's going to be a receptor in the skin measuring the heat, and then there's going to be a sensory neuron. We see it in purple here. Sensory neuron going back to the cord. Again, unipolar. I don't like this drawing because it doesn't show us it shows it like going in over here, but it's okay. Now in this case, we have an interneuron as the integration center, and because we have an interneuron, it's going to change things slightly in terms of the adjectives we use to describe it. Then we have our motor neuron going out to the skeletal muscle, the biceps brachii in this case, and that's your effector, causing you to withdraw that hand. So this is a polysynaptic reflex because we're going to have 2 integration synapses. 2 synapses involving the integration center. So more than one, polysynaptic. It's still ipsilateral, it's still spinal and somatic because stimulus and response are on the same side. Integration is happening in the cord, and a skeletal muscle is the effector. So this is another good example. Let's look at some more. All right, this one gets us slightly more complicated. I'm actually going to discuss 2 reflexes here. One of them we've learned already, which is the withdrawal reflex, and another one called the crossed extensor reflex. And so we got a person here walking wearing their kind of shortish shorts, and they step on this tack. And they're in their barefoot, and they step on the tack, and there's going to be a receptor sensing that pain. Long sensory neuron going all the way up to the spinal cord, dorsal root ganglion, dorsal horn, entering the dorsal horn, synapsing with our inner neuron. And let's not worry about all the pathways here. What I want to follow is just this one right here. I want to follow just this one pathway right here. So the inner neuron goes to this motor neuron, which is going to then go down to our skeletal muscle, which is going to then help us withdraw the foot. So that's basically like the one we looked at in the previous slide with the candle and the finger and all that. It's polysynaptic because there's an inner neuron. It's ipsilateral, same side, spinal because we got the cord as the reflex center, and somatic because we have a skeletal muscle down here doing the effector job. However, there is a whole nother reflex. Starts in the same place. Receptor for the painful stimulus. Sensory neuron, same sensory neuron. Same inner neuron. This inner neuron had some serious branching going on, didn't it? This inner neuron also has a branch crossing the gray commissure, going from the right side of the cord over to the left and synapsing with a motor neuron in the left ventral horn. And that motor neuron is then going to send a signal to one of our quadricep muscles right here. And this is going to stabilize. You're going to actually extend your hip and knee here to stabilize the left leg. Because when you pick up your right foot, you got to stabilize your left leg so that you stay balanced. Now, this is called the crossed extensor reflex. Crossed because we're switching sides. Extensor because our effector is extending some joints. Remember, extension of a joint means the angle is getting bigger, so we're straightening our hip and knee joint here. Now, this crossed extensor reflex is polysynaptic because, again, we got an inner neuron, but it's contralateral. So this is a great example of a contralateral reflex because the stimulus is on the right side. The right foot gets stuck with a tack, and then the response is in the left thigh, the quads of the left thigh. Still a spinal reflex and a somatic reflex for the same reasons as previous, but we see this as a contralateral one, which is pretty neat. All right, I think we have one more reflex to look at. I think that's it. Yeah, this is the last one. This is the pupillary reflex. So if you shine a light into your right eye, your right pupil will constrict. And by the way, you should test this reflex. You don't have to test the withdrawal reflex unless you want to, but you should test this one too. Test the patellar reflex, test the pupillary reflex, and what you'll notice that when you shine the light into the pupil is going to constrict. All right. In fact, if you send me a picture of either one of these reflex tests being done, so either on you or on your subject, I don't care. Send me a picture that show me that you're doing it, and that'll be the latest little bonus points. Okay? So what do we got going on here? We're shining a light into the pupil. Okay? There's going to be a sensory neuron going back to the midbrain. That's where our integration is happening. And then motor neurons coming out to get that sphincter muscle of the pupil to squeeze. Now this makes sense. When you shine a bright light into your eye, you want your pupil to get smaller so that less of that bright light gets in there, because it's not a great experience to get that bright light shining right in your eye. So we got all the same components. We're going to have receptors in our retina. We're going to have sensory neurons, interneurons. You can see the interneurons are labeled down here. Motor neurons too. And we also have the effector, which will be the muscle in the pupil itself. And as far as the adjectives that describe this reflex, it is polysynaptic because we've got interneurons. It is ipsilateral because if I shine a light into my right eye is going to constrict. So that reflex there is ipsilateral. However, this one is cranial because where's our integration happening? It's happening in the midbrain. In the midbrain. So it is a cranial cavity integration as opposed to spinal cavity. Now, lastly, this reflex is also an autonomic reflex because the muscle that constricts your pupil is smooth muscle. You don't have control over that. And remember, when our effector is either smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or a gland, that means it is an autonomic reflex. All reflexes are automatic. Not all of them are autonomic. So don't get confused by that. And with that, guys, we are done. So like I said, send me a picture showing me that you were testing either the patellar reflex, pupillary reflex, however you want to show it to me. That's your bonus question, assignment, project, whatever you want to call it. Yeah, and we're done lab number 20. I will see you guys later.